Welcome again to the Ménagier to Downham market. Today I'm going to talk about taking birds apart, mostly. The related topics are carving and chickens and roasting and such, but it's mostly about taking birds into smaller pieces than they come naturally. So the carving of fowl, or indeed of any meat, was quite a big deal in medieval culture, and very specialist with specialized terms. So in the Book of Kervynge, put out by Wynikyn de Worde in the early 1500s, it begins by listing the various terms associated with taking your beasts apart. Break that deer, lesh it brawn, rear that goose, lift that swan, sauce that capon, spoil that hen, frusha that chicken, unbrace that mallard, unlace that coney, dismember that heron, display that crane, disfigure that peacock, unjoint that biture, untash that curlew, allay that pheasant, wing that partridge, wing that quail, mince that plover, thigh that pigeon, border that pasty, thigh that woodcock, thigh all manner of small birds, timber that fire, tire that egg, chine that salmon, and on and on and on. So that's mostly talking about breaking down cooked animals. You've roasted your pheasant or whatever, and then you break it down, which is not just merely carving, of course. You break down that pheasant by very specifically allaying it. Same with a swan. You don't just cut and carve a swan, you rear a swan. In modern cookery, we don't have quite such a wide variety of fowl available to us most of the time. The most common bird we have to deal with is chicken. Beyond that, turkey perhaps. And if you're fortunate and live in the right areas of the right countries, you can get some game birds. You might get pheasant, you might get partridge, you might get quail, and things like that. But in all cases, what you've got is you start with a bird. Now, if you're going to be cooking, I tend to think that getting a whole bird is a good idea. Whole birds tend to be cheaper, more cost efficient than buying ones that have already been broken up. If you're cooking for a small household, for a family, and people like different parts of a bird, some like the wings, and some like the thighs, and some like the breasts, and some like the leg, then if you buy a whole bird and break it up yourself, it's very easy to make sure that everybody gets the bits they like, which is always nice. I tend to do it even if I'm cooking for a very larger group. And when I'm doing a feast or a banquet for a larger number of people, I tend to go with one chicken course, and it tends to be early on in the running order. And that's partly because chicken is, again, a pretty cost-effective way to get protein on the table. But I tend to go with chicken, and much of the time, unless I get a real deal, I'm going to want to buy whole chickens, break them down myself, and that way you get the backs and maybe the wingtips to make broth that you can then also use in other recipes. So again, it's another way to get the most value for money for your ingredients if you're doing a large-scale banquet or feast, to use the bits and pieces that might otherwise go to waste. So that involves breaking it down. Now, in the medieval texts, what we tend to find is phrases like this one from the Forme of Cury, Crustardes of flessh, which says simply, take pigeons, chickens, and small brids, smite him in gobbets, seethe him, etc. Smite him in gobbets. So you could just throw them down on the table and take a cleaver to them and smite them thoroughly into gobbets. which is reasonably effective. But it's tidier if you can break it down into more usable chunks. And again, save some of the bits which people are less likely to want to eat directly in order to make stock or whatever. So the smiting into gobbets is not a method I tend to use. What I want to do is to break the chicken down. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate here in just a moment, is breaking chickens down. It's not that hard to do. Practice, of course, helps with everything. And if you're doing a feast or a banquet for 140, 150 people where you're going to break down 40 chickens into quarters, by the end of that time, you get to where you can do it fairly rapidly, and that's a skill that doesn't go away. But even if you're only doing it now and then for a small household, for your family, it's worth the effort. And it lets you cook the bits that people like with very little waste. On to the kitchen.
So you can use a couple of different tools when you're going to break a chicken down. The basic principle is the same, though, and the idea is always that you're trying to go through the soft bits rather than the hard bits, so joints rather than bones. So I usually start with wings and snip through the skin out around where the wing joins, and then crack, and that points out where the weak spot is, where the joint is, and the wing just pops right off. Some people suggest taking the very tip of the wing off, because there's really not much on there, and just saving it for stock. I sometimes do that. If I'm going to be roasting it, then a lot of times I'll leave that on, because if you roast it, especially if you're roasting it whole, the wing tip gets very crunchy, and you can just eat the whole thing, crunchy roasted bones and all. But for this particular application, what I'm making tonight, I think I will save that and use it for stock. So, same thing on the other side. I'm using kitchen shears for this. You can certainly use a knife, and as I say, it's the same basic idea, but the shears, I think, are a little easier. So if you've got shears, that's the approach I would take. I'll probably do another chicken at some point and use a knife just to show. So that's the wings. Then I do legs, and I do leg quarters. So once again, get through the skin here just to loosen it up a little bit, at which point you can start to see where the leg and the thigh attach. And then again, you just bend, and you can see it where it cracks out, and you've disjointed it, and there's the leg quarter. Same thing on the other side. Get through the skin, and once you've got through the skin, you can start to see where it's attached, but then you just sort of reach up and bend it back until you see where the joint is. Snip straight through the joint down there. Breasts and back. Backs are great because you can use them for stock. If I'm going to roast it whole, of course, that's a different animal. But here, this is where the shears really come in handy, because you just sort of snip right along the bottom edge, and just goes right through very easily. Only hard bit is up there, and it's not even that hard, but up at that end where the wishbone is. Then same thing on the other side, and just snipping down there at the very bottom of it. Back, out, ready for stock. So then you've got the whole breast. You can see along there where the line is, and then you just take your scissors or your knife, and this part is actually where a cleaver or a knife is slightly better than the shears. But you just go through like that. And there's your two whole breasts. Then typically what I do at this point, because I usually want more breast pieces, is I just grind right through the bone, because that's really not the biggest, hardest bits of bone on the bird at that point. And then I've got 4 breast portions. That's it. It's pretty quick, it's pretty easy. If you've got, if what you have is a knife rather than shears, it's the same idea, you just use the knife rather than the shears. Where the shears really, as I say, really are handy is getting that backbone out. Other than that, it's kind of a toss-up as to which one's easier. In any case, that's how you break that down if you want to cook it in Gobbets, or if you want to just get your breasts and your things and keep the rest of it for stock.